All right, strap in, everyone, because we are diving deep today into sanctions compliance and European banking.
Ooh, that sounds exciting.
It is, actually. It might not sound super glamorous at first, but it's actually way more interesting than you might think. And the impact it has is huge. We've been doing a ton of research on this, and trust me, it's a wild ride.
Yeah, I mean, you've probably heard about all the new sanctions, especially since the war in Ukraine started. But what a lot of people don't realize is just how much these sanctions are shaking up, like the entire financial system.
It's a total game
It
changer.
really is. And the complexity of these new sanctions is a whole other level. We're not just talking about, freezing some assets here and there anymore.
Right, it's so much more than that now.
It is. Take the G7 oil price cap as an example. That's been a big one.
Oh, yeah, that one sounds like a real headache to try and enforce.
It is. It definitely is. Instead of just like a straight up ban on Russian oil, they decided to set a maximum price that buyers can pay.
So the idea is to kind of squeeze Russia's revenue without causing oil prices to, like, totally skyrocket.
Exactly. It's all about finding that sweet spot. But to make it actually work, you need a ton of coordination between countries and constant monitoring to make sure everyone is actually following the rules.
I can see how that would create a mountain of extra work for banks.
Oh, absolutely.
Uh-huh.
And that's just one piece of the puzzle. We're also seeing what are called narrative rules becoming more and more common. And these are
Wow.
they go way beyond just screening for names on a sanctions list.
So it's not just about knowing who you're dealing with, but also understanding exactly what they're buying or selling.
Exactly. Banks have to scrutinize every single transaction, looking at the specific goods or services involved to make sure they don't accidentally break some obscure rule.
So it's like you have to be a detective almost.
Kinda, yeah. And all of this is happening while the whole landscape of sanctions is constantly shifting.
Because new sanctions pop up all the time, right?
They do, seemingly overnight sometimes.
Hmm.
And the people who are trying to, get around the sanctions are getting more and more creative.
It's like a constant game of cat and mouse.
It really is. And that's where AI comes in. It's becoming absolutely crucial for keeping up.
So AI is being used to help enforce these sanctions.
Big time. And it's not just about making things faster. It's about finding those hidden connections and patterns that would be impossible for humans to spot in such massive amounts of data.
So banks are basically using AI to be their superpowered compliance detectives.
You could say that, yeah.
That's so cool.
It is really cool.
Yeah.
Like in transaction monitoring, for example. Traditional systems rely on predefined rules.
So they're kind of limited in what they can catch.
Exactly. But AI can learn from past cases and flag suspicious activity, even if it doesn't match a specific rule.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
It's like having a detective who can predict the criminal's next move.
So AI is really changing the game when it comes to sanctions compliance.
For sure. But it's important to remember that AI is just a tool. You still need experienced humans to look at the results, make decisions, and take action.
So you're saying compliance officers aren't going to be replaced by robots anytime soon?
Not at all. It's more about a partnership between humans and AI.
That makes sense.
Working together is how you create the most robust and responsive compliance program. And this is really just scratching the surface of what AI can do in this area. It can also be used to streamline internal policy updates, improve risk assessments, and even predict future sanctions.
Predict future sanctions. That sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie.
It might sound futuristic, but it's actually becoming a reality.
So how does that even work?
Well, by analyzing geopolitical trends and patterns from past sanctions, AI can actually help banks anticipate potential risks and prepare in advance.
So instead of just reacting to every new crisis, banks can actually get ahead of the curve.
Exactly. And that's a major advantage in this super complex and fast-paced world.
I'm starting to see why you said it's like playing 5D chess.
It is. It really is.
It's not just about knowing the rules, but understanding the strategies, anticipating the moves, and adapting to a constantly changing game board.
You got it. And the stakes are incredibly high, too. We've seen enforcement cases in Europe surge by like 580% since 2020.
Whoa, 580%.
And then the fines are not small either.
So there's a real financial incentive for banks to get this right.
Absolutely. But it goes beyond just the money, too. Getting caught in a sanctions violation can totally wreck a bank's reputation.
Which is everything in the financial world.
Right. Trust is key.
So it's a real balancing act.
It is.
Banks need to be aggressive enough to comply with all these rules, but they also have to be careful not to disrupt legitimate business.
Exactly. And that's why we're seeing banks put so much effort into building truly robust compliance programs. They're not just ticking boxes to satisfy regulators anymore.
So what does a truly robust program actually look like? What makes it different from just basic screening?
Well, it all starts with understanding the risks. You can't manage what you don't understand, right? So it means going beyond just screening for names on a list. You have to dig into the details of each transaction.
So you're looking for any potential red flags, analyzing patterns, and understanding the context of each transaction.
Exactly. And this requires not just fancy technology, but also a deep understanding of the regulations and a culture of compliance within the entire organization.
So it's not just about having the right tools, but also having the right mindset and approach.
Exactly. And that's where things are getting really interesting because we're seeing banks move beyond these traditional compliance models. They're starting to embrace more strategic and technology-driven approaches.
And I'm guessing AI is at the heart of that transformation.
It totally is. Think of it this way. AI and machine learning are like the editorial team for a bank's sanctions compliance novel.
Okay, I like that analogy.
They analyze massive amounts of data to make sure every transaction is, well, squeaky clean.
So instead of relying on a basic spell checker, they're using AI to do a full grammar and style check on every transaction.
Exactly. And remember, we're talking about huge amounts of data here. AI can process information at a speed and scale that humans just can't match.
It's like having a team of superpowered researchers working 24/7 to make sure everything is legit.
That's a great way to put it. And this efficiency isn't just about saving money. It's about using technology to do compliance better and more effectively.
And I imagine that frees up compliance officers to focus on the more complex and nuanced cases.
Exactly. They can spend less time on routine tasks and more time investigating potential red flags, developing risk mitigation strategies, and, staying ahead of the curve.
Speaking of staying ahead of the curve, you mentioned that AI can even be used to predict future sanctions. How does that work?
Imagine you're trying to predict the weather. You would gather data on things like temperature, wind speed, and humidity, right?
Right, you're looking for patterns and trends.
Exactly. And it's the same principle with sanctions prediction. AI can analyze tons of data on geopolitical events, past sanctions, economic indicators, and more to try and identify potential risks.
So it's like having a team of geopolitical analysts constantly scanning the globe for any signs of trouble.
That's a great way to put it. And this early warning system is incredibly valuable for banks.
Because it lets them prepare in advance.
Exactly.
So instead of just reacting to what's happening today, they can anticipate what might happen tomorrow.
Precisely, and that's a major advantage in today's unpredictable world.
I can see why you said this field is so fascinating. It's a constant cat and mouse game, but with incredibly high stakes.
It definitely is. The rules are always changing, the players are getting more sophisticated, and the technology is evolving at an incredible pace.
It sounds like you need a PhD in international relations, a black belt in data analysis, and a crystal ball just to keep up.
Huh? Maybe not all of that. But it definitely helps to be adaptable, analytical, and always willing to learn.
This has been a really great overview. It's amazing to see how much technology is shaping the world of sanctions compliance. But what about the human side of things?
That's a great point. Technology is a powerful tool, but it's not a magic solution. At the end of the day, it's humans who make the decisions, interpret the data, and make sure these compliance programs are actually effective.
So it's still a very human-centric field, even with all the advances in AI.
Absolutely. You need experienced professionals who understand the ins and outs of sanctions regulations.
People who can analyze complex situations and make good judgments.
Exactly. It's not just about knowing the rules, but understanding the context, the intent, and the potential consequences.
It sounds like the ideal sanctions compliance professional is a rare breed, part data scientist, part diplomat, and part detective.
You could say that, yeah.
I'm starting to understand why this is such a hot topic right now. It's not just about following the rules, it's about protecting the integrity of the whole financial system, upholding international security, and ultimately promoting a more stable and peaceful world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This has been a really insightful conversation. I'm sure our listeners are already starting to see how all of this fits together.
I hope so.
But we've only just scratched the surface.
We've got so much more to explore.
We do.
In the next part of our deep dive, we'll delve even further into the practical implications of sanctions compliance. We'll look at some specific case studies and explore how banks are actually using technology to stay ahead of the game.
I can't wait. This is getting good.
Picking up where we left off, those sanctions targeting Russia are a perfect example of this whole complexity thing. We're seeing this move away from the old school asset freezes And it's shifting towards these more intricate measures like that G7 oil price cap we talked about.
Yeah, we touched on it earlier, but I think it's worth digging a little deeper. How does this price cap thing actually work in the real world?
Okay, so imagine there's this super rare collectible everyone wants, and the market is just going bonkers. Prices are through the roof. Then the authorities come in and say, nope, no one can sell this for more than X dollars.
So they're setting a limit.
Yeah. Exactly, a price ceiling. And that's basically what the oil price cap does for Russian oil. It limits how much they can sell it for on the global market.
So instead of a total ban, they're trying to control Russia's profits without completely messing up the global supply.
You got it. It's a really delicate balance, and it requires this whole new level of monitoring and enforcement to make it work.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's not like you can just go to the gas station and check the price on the pump to see if they're following the rules. How do they even make sure everyone's complying with this cap?
Lots and lots of paperwork, verifying everything, tracking all the transactions.
Yeah.
Remember how we were talking about banks having to scrutinize not just who they're dealing with, but also the actual stuff being traded?
Yeah.
Well, this is where that gets super important.
So banks are kind of like the frontline enforcers for this price cap.
Pretty much, yeah. And it adds this whole other layer of complexity to their compliance burden. They have to verify where the oil came from, track its price all along the supply chain, and basically make sure no one's trying to cheat the system.
I can see how that would need some serious data analysis.
Oh, absolutely. That's where our friend AI comes in again. AI and machine learning can help banks analyze all that data and pinpoint any weird patterns or red flags that might mean someone's trying to get around the cap.
It's like having a whole team of digital detectives combing through all the records.
That's a great way to put it.
Shipping manifests, invoices, bank statements.
All of it, connecting the dots. And as those tactics to get around the rules get more and more advanced, well, the tools to catch them have to keep up too.
It's like a constant arms race.
It really is. And the stakes are high, like we said, not just in terms of money, but for global security and stability too.
Speaking of that, you mentioned earlier that sanctions are about more than just the financial side of things. What did you mean by that?
So a lot of times, sanctions are used as a foreign policy tool, a way to put pressure on certain countries or even individuals who are doing things that threaten international peace and security.
Like human rights violations, things like that.
Exactly. Or terrorism, developing weapons of mass destruction,
Right.
those kinds of things.
So it's like the international community saying, we're not going to play ball with you until you change your ways.
Exactly. And by complying with those sanctions, banks and other financial institutions, they're actually playing a crucial role in upholding those international standards.
So it goes beyond just avoiding fines or bad press. It's about being responsible global citizens.
You got it. And that sense of responsibility is just becoming more and more important as the world gets more interconnected. The actions of bad actors can have far-reaching consequences now.
That's true. It raises an important question, though. What about the downsides of sanctions? Are there unintended consequences we need to be aware of?
Oh, for sure. That's a really important point. Sometimes sanctions can backfire, especially when it comes to innocent civilians or countries that aren't even the target.
Right.
I've heard concerns about sanctions making humanitarian crises even worse or destabilizing economies that are already struggling. Those are totally valid concerns. And it's why when you're designing and implementing sanctions, you have to be really careful and think it through. There's always this trade-off between achieving those political goals and trying to minimize any unintended damage.
It's like walking a tightrope.
It is.
Yeah.
And it needs constant monitoring and evaluation to make sure the sanctions are actually working the way they're supposed to.
So it's not something you can just set up and forget about.
Nope, not at all. The whole sanctions landscape is always changing. New ones pop up, old ones get tweaked, and the methods people use to try to get around them, those get more sophisticated all the time.
Sounds like you need to be on your toes to keep up.
You do. And that's why it's so important for banks to have these really strong compliance programs that can adapt to all those changes.
So it's not just about checking boxes and following the rules by the book. It's about having a deeper understanding of why those rules exist and how to apply those principles to new situations.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture of compliance that permeates the whole organization.
That makes sense. But how do you actually do that? How do you create that kind of culture?
Well, it has to start at the top. Senior management needs to make it clear that compliance is a top priority, not just something they have to do, and they need to actually provide the resources and support to make it happen.
So it's more than just having some policies written down somewhere.
Right. It's about making compliance everyone's responsibility.
And that takes training, constant communication, and a real commitment to ethical behavior from the top down.
You got it.
Sounds like a big job.
It can be, but the payoff of having a strong compliance culture is huge. Not only does it reduce the risk of running afoul of sanctions and all the bad press that comes with that, but it actually creates a more ethical and sustainable business overall.
And probably helps attract and keep good employees, too.
Absolutely. People want to work for companies that share their values. And showing a strong commitment to compliance is a good way to do that.
So it's not just good for business, it's good for the world, too.
Exactly. And that's why I find this whole area of sanctions compliance so fascinating and important.
Oh, well said. Now, you were talking about AI playing a bigger and bigger role in all this. Can you give us some real-world examples of how it's actually being used?
Oh, sure. One area where AI is making a huge impact is in transaction monitoring. Traditional systems, they rely on these rules-based approaches, which means they can only flag transactions that match very specific criteria.
So if someone's trying to get around sanctions in a new and clever way, it might slip through the cracks.
Exactly. But AI can learn from all the past cases and flag something suspicious, even if it doesn't fit neatly into a predefined rule.
That's pretty powerful.
It is. It's like having a detective who can think outside the box, spotting patterns that humans might miss. And this ability to spot those anomalies, that's key for staying ahead of all those tricky sanctions evasion tactics.
So AI is basically giving banks a leg up.
It is. And it's not just limited to transaction monitoring either. AI is also being used to vet customers better, figure out which entities are high risk, and even predict future sanctions like we talked about before.
It's like having a crystal ball for sanctions compliance.
Oh, well, not quite a crystal ball. But it definitely gives banks some valuable insights into emerging risks and trends.
That must be super helpful for navigating this whole complex landscape.
It is. It lets them be more proactive and strategic with their compliance efforts.
So instead of just reacting to what's happening right now, they can anticipate potential problems and head them off at the pass.
Exactly. That's essential for staying ahead of the game in this field.
All this is super impressive, but I'm curious about the limits of AI in all this. Are there areas where human expertise is still absolutely necessary?
Oh, absolutely. As amazing as AI is, it's not a magic bullet. We have to remember that AI systems are trained on data. And if that data is biased or incomplete, well, the results are going to be messed up too.
So you still need human judgment to look at the results, make sure they make sense in the real world.
Exactly. Plus, there are just some tasks that need that human intuition and experience. Like when you're investigating potential sanctions violations, you need people who can grasp all those subtle nuances, gather evidence, and make informed decisions.
So it's not about AI replacing humans, it's more about them working together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
AI is augmenting human capabilities, not getting rid of them.
And I bet the most effective compliance programs are the ones that find that right balance.
Absolutely. AI brings the speed and scale, and humans bring that experience, judgment, and ethical considerations.
It's a powerful partnership.
It is. And as AI gets even smarter, we can expect even more innovative uses in the world of sanctions compliance.
That's exciting, but it also makes me wonder about what this all means for people working in this field. What skills will compliance professionals need to have in this AI-driven future?
That's a great question. I think we're going to see a big demand for people who can bridge the gap between the tech side and the compliance side.
So people who understand both the technical stuff about AI and all the intricacies of sanctions regulations.
Exactly. They'll need to be able to look at the output from those AI systems, spot the risks, and make good decisions based on that information.
Sounds like a pretty challenging but also pretty rewarding career path.
It is. And as sanctions compliance becomes even more important, I think we'll see more and more talented people getting drawn to this field.
I can definitely see that. This has been a really insightful conversation. I've learned a ton about how complex this whole world of sanctions compliance really is.
Me too. It's such a fascinating field.
Yeah.
And it's constantly changing.
And one that has a real impact on the world.
Absolutely. By enforcing sanctions effectively, we can actually help to promote peace, stability, and human rights across the globe.
I love that perspective. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what the future holds for sanctions compliance.
Well, I think we're going to see even more innovation when it comes to using technology, especially AI and machine learning.
That seems like a safe bet, given how much data is involved in all of this.
Right. And as these technologies get more sophisticated, They're going to give banks even better tools to detect and prevent sanctions violations.
So we're talking about even more powerful tools to combat financial crime.
Exactly. But I can't emphasize this enough. Technology alone isn't going to solve everything.
You've been really clear about that through our conversation.
It's so important to remember that sanctions compliance at its core is a human endeavor. It requires judgment, experience, and a commitment to doing the right thing.
So that human element will always be crucial.
Absolutely. And I think we're going to see more and more emphasis on training and supporting compliance professionals who can work effectively alongside all these fancy new technologies.
That makes sense. You need people who understand both what AI can do and what its limitations are.
Exactly. People who can use it as a tool to enhance their own judgment and decision-making.
So the future of sanctions compliance is really about this blend of human expertise and technological innovation.
You nailed it. And I think this combination is going to be key for successfully navigating the challenges of this increasingly complex and interconnected world.
I couldn't agree more. This has been such a fascinating discussion. Thanks so much for sharing your insights with us.
My pleasure.
I know our listeners are probably eager to hear about some real-world examples of all this in action.
Well, we'll be getting into that in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at some specific case studies and talk about what all of this actually means in practice.
Can't wait. This is getting really interesting. All right, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into sanctions compliance. You ready to get into the nitty-gritty of how this all actually works in the real world?
Absolutely. Let's do it. We've talked a lot about the big picture, but now it's time to zoom in on the practical side of things.
Exactly. I bet our listeners are eager to hear about some real-world examples.
One thing that often gets overlooked is just how important data quality is.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, you can have the most amazing cutting-edge AI systems in the world, but if the data you're feeding them is garbage, well, your results are going to be garbage too.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So banks really need to invest in data cleansing and validation processes. They got to make sure the information their systems are using is accurate and reliable.
It's like building a house on a shaky foundation, right? No matter how fancy the structure is, it's not going to last long.
That's a great analogy. And it's an ongoing effort too. Data quality isn't a one-time fix. It needs constant monitoring and maintenance.
So it's not just about collecting data. It's about making sure that data is clean, consistent, and up to date.
Precisely. And that's where data governance comes in.
Yeah.
Banks need to have clear policies and procedures for managing their data throughout its entire life cycle.
So from the point of collection to analysis and reporting.
Exactly. We're talking about data standardization, enrichment, quality checks, the whole 9 yards.
So it's a pretty involved process.
It is. And it's only getting more important as the volume and complexity of data just keeps growing.
Especially with the rise of big data and AI.
Absolutely. AI systems are only as good as the data they're trained on, so if you want accurate and reliable results, you got to start with high-quality data.
Makes perfect sense. Now, let's talk about the role of human expertise in all of this. We've established that AI is a powerful tool, but it's not a replacement for human judgment.
No, definitely not. AI can help automate tasks, identify patterns, and provide insights, but it's still up to humans to interpret those insights and make the final decisions.
So it's more of a partnership, really, humans and machines working together.
Exactly. And that partnership is absolutely crucial for effective sanctions compliance.
Can you give us an example of how this works in practice?
Sure. Let's say an AI system flags a transaction as potentially suspicious. Maybe it's a large transfer of funds to a high-risk country, or an unusual pattern of activity that doesn't fit the customer's normal behavior.
So it's basically raising a red flag.
Exactly. But it's not necessarily proof of wrongdoing. You need a human analyst to investigate further.
To look at the context of the transaction, gather more information, and ultimately make a judgment call.
Precisely. And this requires a deep understanding of sanctions regulations, financial crime, and the customer's business.
So it's kind of like being a detective, right? You have to piece together all the clues and build a case.
That's a great analogy. It really highlights the importance of human expertise in this field.
So even with AI, compliance professionals still need to be sharp and analytical.
Oh, absolutely. They need to be able to think critically, connect the dots, and make sound decisions even when they don't have all the information.
And they need to be able to explain their reasoning to others.
Exactly. Transparency and accountability are essential in sanctions compliance.
Especially when you're dealing with sensitive situations.
Precisely. So while AI can definitely make things more efficient and accurate, It's important to remember that human judgment and expertise are still essential.
Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the role of regulators in all this. What's their perspective on everything we've been talking about?
Regulators play a huge role in setting the standards for sanctions compliance. They issue guidance, conduct inspections, and enforce the rules.
So they're the ones making sure everyone's playing by the rules.
Exactly. And they're increasingly focused on the use of technology in compliance. They want to make sure banks are using AI and other tools effectively, but also responsibly.
That makes sense. There's always a risk that new technologies can be misused or create new vulnerabilities.
Exactly. So regulators are trying to strike a balance. They want to encourage innovation while also ensuring safety and soundness.
Sounds like a tricky balancing act.
It is, and it requires a lot of collaboration between regulators, banks, and technology providers.
So it's a real team effort.
Absolutely. Everyone has a role to play in making sure sanctions compliance is effective.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. We've covered so much ground, from the geopolitical context of sanctions to the practical implications of compliance. We've explored the role of AI, the importance of data quality, and the need for human expertise.
We have. It's been a great discussion.
I think our listeners now have a much deeper understanding of this complex and ever-evolving field.
I hope so. It's a topic that deserves a lot more attention.
Absolutely. Sanctions compliance is crucial for maintaining global security and stability, and it's only going to become more important in the years to come.
I agree. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
I'm all ears.
Sanctions compliance isn't just about following the rules. It's about upholding our values.
That's a powerful statement.
It's about standing up for what's right, protecting the innocent, and ultimately promoting a more just and peaceful world.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on.
I agree.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and insightful.
Yes, thank you for having me.
And we encourage you to continue exploring this important topic. Until next time, keep diving deep.